Okay, well, welcome to this last session of the Battle of Ideas 2019. And I think we're in for a good final session. My name's Shirley Lawes, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Frank Furedi to you, although that's probably not entirely necessary. Frank has made numerous contributions at every single Battle of Ideas festival. He's a sociologist, social commentator and prolific writer on a huge variety of issues that trouble and challenge society today. And his works range from an examination of the culture of fear, populism and authority, to parenting, tolerance, and not least several books on education and all sorts of aspects. Now today, he's going to share his thoughts on what we can learn from the 60s and the sexual revolution, ? I don't want to preempt Frank's lecture, but I'm pretty sure he's not going to do a trip down memory lane. He won't be revealing any personal secrets, although who knows, or announcing that his next book is the update of The Joys of Sex. Who knows, but let's see. So let's just find out now, Frank. Thank you.
Well, I was going to talk about my personal experiences, but it would have been a very short lecture, so I decided that's not really on. But I think this is actually quite a serious subject, because although we tend to think of the so-called sexual revolution in the 60s in a kind of very expansive, liberating terms, I think when you look at it a little bit closer, what you really find is that there were some very important developments with lots of potential, lots of kind of what I see as being liberating potential in terms of opening up possibilities. But at the same time, there are also a number of fairly negative and regressive trends as well. And I think we've got to take a balanced view on what we can learn from this. I think that the context of the 1960s sexual revolution has got to be the unraveling of the prevailing cultural norms. I think bourgeois culture in the 1960s was going through a very major crisis and could no longer sort of uphold its view of the world. And that also pertained to the sexual domain as much as all the other domains of everyday life. And I think you'll find that if you look at it closely, you'll find that the foundations, the early beginnings of what's called the sexual revolution actually began a long time before the 1960s. And you'll find that there are some very important first steps in that direction. And in fact, probably if there is anything that undermined normal conventions on sexuality and on sexual behavior, it kicked in 1948 when you had the publication of the first Kinsey report. I don't know if any of you ever read the Kinsey report or you heard of Kinsey, but in 1948, a report was published called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And about 5 years later, this first publication was followed up by the second Kinsey report. This was in 1953, called Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. And at the time, I mean, I'm probably the oldest person in the room, but I'm not old enough to have been around then. But certainly when you look at the historical accounts, you'll find that these reports had a very major kind of impact upon everyday life, because it was really reported fairly widely. I think Kinsey very fast became a household name. I mean, all the magazines and all the newspapers commented on these two reports. And what was very interesting about it is that these reports were seen as scientific reports on intimate life. They were seen as scientific statements upon the intimate sexual behavior of men and women. And for the first time, something that was not seen as an appropriate subject, an appropriate topic for scientific knowledge and discussion, or even for clinical discussion, suddenly sex became seen in a very different way, as a kind of issue or as a problem that you could both begin to discuss openly in the media, in the press, and also begin to discuss within the educational environment in a normal kind of sense. And a lot of people argued that with the publication of the Kinsey report, sexuality was kind of brought out into the open, and it was freed from the kind of mystique and the mystifications that existed previously, that somehow sexuality was, somehow seen in a very different light, because all the things that you thought about, all the things that you might have discussed with your best friend, suddenly were no longer seen as being secrets. All of a sudden, sex became a topic and a subject that you can debate and discuss in the public domain. And you'll find that a lot of people were saying how brave Kinsey was, what an important contribution Kinsey reports were making to the enlightenment of society. And I think that kind of legacy of Kinsey is still very much with us. I think a lot of people still refer to those reports as marking this very positive step towards demystifying sex, liberating sex, making sure that sex could now be discussed on a normal, regular basis. You could have sex education classes in school. All these things were seen as being really critically important. Myself, I think that there was another side to the Kinsey report which needs to be taken into account, which I think brings out its more problematic side, which is that one of the things that happened with the Kinsey report is that it kind of unleashed a process where sex and sexuality became increasingly detached from its everyday human context, from its relational context. I think what happened was that the more that sex and sexual relations were treated as this scientifically observable facts, the more it also created a situation where sex began to be discussed in this very clinical manner, pretty much in the way you would discuss people's medical condition, or pretty much in the way you would discuss dieting or food. When sex began to be, if it's for me, I'm not here, by the way. If sex began to be discussed in that kind of a way, it did have this effect of disenchanting sex from its mystique. Sex and sexual relations usually were kind of framed for most human beings in a kind of language that didn't simply treat sex as a purely physical, biological act. It wasn't simply seen as a kind of purely kind of physical interaction between two human beings that you could reduce to those biological qualities. Most people tended to attach certain values, certain, in some cases, some romantic kind of values, in other cases, some other kind of cultural norms to the sexual encounter. And I think what happened was that as sex was beginning to be seen as an appropriate subject for laboratory kind of investigation, so sex began to acquire this kind of autonomy, this kind of detachment from the relationships within which it observed. And I think one consequence, some people brought this out, is that as sex becomes disenchanted, and as sex becomes merely seen in terms of its natural biological quality, it loses some of its meaning, certainly some of the meaning that it had for people, because for most people, a sexual relationship wasn't just simply a physical act. You kind of did something and you say, thank you very much, and you kind of moved on with the rest of your life. It has some kind of other kind of deep, in some cases not so deep, but nevertheless some kind of a meaning and in terms of the interaction that it led to. One of the other consequences of the Kinsey report, and Kinsey was very insistent on this, is that it called for non-judgmentalism in sexual matters, that we mustn't judge what kind of sexual relations were appropriate, what kind of sexual relationships were not appropriate. And I think that in the course of being non-judgmental about sex, and in terms of discussing sex in this kind of naturalistic, biological way, what you began to have is a situation where when sex begins to be discussed just like any other subject, any other matter, it kind of lost its previous privileged position as a kind of special subject, as a unique subject that somehow had contained within it a variety of different meanings. What was not noticed at the time when Kinsey wrote these reports is that the detachment of sex from its cultural and moral setting and its reduction to a biological, essentially physical act, what was not noticed at that time is that in so doing, you had the beginning of a situation where the potential for sex to be fetishized, began to kick in. I think it's at this point in time where that when sex is seen as something that exists very much within its own terms, that sex itself, begins to become an independent, autonomous entity. It's at that point in time that people begin to talk about their sex life. Not my life, but what's your sex life like? It's at that point in time that you're beginning to talk about sex in its own domain as being something sort of distinct and separate. And in some contexts and in some situations, people begin to fetishize sex as somehow having its own inner logic that has an importance for you simply in its own terms, rather than what sex means in terms of the way it brings you together with other people, the relationships that you have forged around it. It begins to have this kind of autonomous kind of character to it. And I think that one of to me, the most destructive effect of the discussion around the Kinsey report, and it connects the Kinsey report to the 1960s, it's not really perceived very clearly at that point because the situation hasn't really crystallized, is that gradually with the open discussion of sex, which I've got no problems with, I think everything should be discussed openly, with the open discussion of sex, you have the beginning of a process where the boundary that separated the private, intimate sphere from the public sphere begins to get eroded and eroded and eroded. So that kind of distinction between what you do in public and what you do in private, or what you allow yourself to show in private, but not in public, those kinds of distinctions gradually begin to lose their force to the point at which, in the 21st century, we no longer have an expression that I remember as a child, sexual exhibitionism. I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember the exhibitionist. I think today the exhibitionists are fairly normal, average kind of people, whose behavior is today seen as being okay. It's an identity, that's the way they are. They're no longer seen in that kind of stigmatizing way that in my childhood we kind of figured, well, why is this guy, showing us everything where that is something that you do within the private sphere. So gradually the sphere between the private, intimate, and the public also begins to kick in, and I'll come back to this point later on. And the final sociological impact of the Kinsey report, which kind of again feeds into the 1960s, is you have the beginning of what I call the disenchantment of love. In the old days, there used to be this prejudice that somehow having sex with somebody also meant you liked them. It wasn't just simply done in that kind of indifferent kind of way. It also meant that you might even have loved them, or it was the beginning of a kind of dynamic that would lead to some kind of intimate, loving kind of relationship. And people actually did use the word love a little bit more frequently than we do today. And there was a kind of mystique. It might have been, not based on very much, but nevertheless, there was this mystique, this kind of romantic mystique that enveloped the sexual act. And what you have, with the medicalization of sex, which is what Kinsey begins to do, is the disenchantment of love and the disenchantment of sex, that kind of mystical, element of discovery that used to exist with what in the old days we used to call foreplay. Again, a word that isn't used very much anymore. Is something that goes by the side. So what you have with Kinsey is a situation where sex becomes exposed to rationalization, calculation, and expertise. I mean, this is the point at which you have the emergence of the sex expert. I often think, what makes them experts? When they get laid, is it really an experience that's, not available to me, sort of, what is going on, that I should know about, but nevertheless, there are these sex experts that emerge, and they basically are in the business of telling us, a lot about, what we should be doing and how we should do it. And I think what Kinsey does at that particular time is they both inflate the importance of sex. It kind of acquires this incredible importance, which eventually will become the foundation for identity 40 years later, 30 years later. So it both inflates the meaning of sex by detaching it and giving it its autonomous power, but it also trivializes it. The very act of medicalizing sex by, sort of turning sex into a biological function begins to kind of trivialize it. So what I want to argue is that the intellectual and the cultural foundations for the sexual revolution were already in place a long time before the 1960s. And basically what happened in the 1960s is you had a generation that could act upon these ideals in a way that had no risk attached to it. When you rebelled and you adopted a sexually subversive attitude and you revolted, you were essentially kicking against open doors. And in a sense, although there was some very positive things in the 60s, because it was a period of sexual experimentation, which is not a bad thing, and because you challenged many of the mystifications surrounding sex, again, that isn't a particularly kind of bad thing. There was a kind of tension nevertheless, because in this positive attempt to experiment, what you also had was the situation where the potential for the tendency to fetishize sex began to kick in. And when you look at the conformist temper that comes after the 1960s, it is the fetishization of sex aspect of it that becomes really important. And I think you can see very swiftly how the potential, the liberation potential of the sexual revolution became exhausted no sooner than it emerged. I think a very good example of what I'm talking about, I think something that most people can relate to, is the contraceptive pill. I mean, most of you know, especially if you're a woman, maybe not some of the men in the room, that there is such a thing as a contraceptive pill. It began to be used a lot in the 1960s, and a lot of people considered, quite rightly, that the contraceptive pill had an incredibly liberating potential. It kind of allowed women to control their fertility. It provided an opportunity to avoid getting pregnant, which was always one of the big risks for a lot of women in terms of having sex. And a lot of people regarded this pill as this wonderful sort of technological innovation that would actually improve the quality of sex because it removed the fear of getting pregnant. And I think the potential for the pill, it was phenomenal. I think it's one of the greatest and most useful inventions of that time, something that sort of we should be very, very thankful for. But the interesting thing is that no sooner is the contraceptive pill invented than instead of celebrating it, a lot of people begin to talk about its downsides. And by the 1970s, you have people talking about how the hormones in contraceptive pill will kind of create this and that side effects for you. You have the beginning of a discussion, well, actually, the contraceptive pill is really bad because it takes away the responsibility for controlling fertility from the man, and men can now do whatever they feel like because they know that the women are going to not to get pregnant, and all these negative stories begin to circulate about the contraceptive pill, to the point at which, when you look at the 21st century, we have something like, sort of what's called emergency contraception, which is or the morning after pill, whatever you want to call it. And instead of celebrating this pill, we call it an emergency pill, something that, my God, I will only take it in an emergency, instead of understanding that it's potentially quite a positive, liberating thing. And I think the reason why the potential of these innovations becomes exhausted very, very fast is because the sexual revolution essentially became dominated by the Kinsey type of medicalizing impulse. And that had a number of negative effects that we're still living with. To me, one of the most negative consequences of this is that increasingly the sphere of intimacy loses its valuable position. Intimacy begins to be seen as not all that important. Increasingly, the public manifestation of sexuality acquires a greater and greater force. One of its consequences is that by the time you get to the late 70s, sex is no longer something that you do, but sex becomes the basis for your identity. So at the beginnings of identity politics that's related to sexuality. But not only that, as sex acquires this kind of autonomy, it begins to become medicalized to the point at which it's regarded as not all that different than talking about your diet or talking about any aspects of your medical condition. So you have the inventions of what I think is one of the most bizarre terms in the 20th century, which is the development of the idea of sexual health. Have you ever heard of sexual health? Which I don't even not quite understand, because when I have sex, I don't do it for my health. It's not like, sort of like brushing my teeth because it's good for my gum. Where I come from, you have either good sex or bad sex. It's not a issue to do with health. And when you look at the definition of sexual health, the way it's defined by the World Health Organization, it's almost defined as this kind of state of enlightenment. It's got this kind of incredibly ill-defined kind of category to it. That sex is this phenomenon that you gotta strive to achieve. To have sexual health, you don't just go to bed with somebody, but there are all these kind of preconditions that you gotta go through. And as you have the detachment of sex, you not only have sexual identity, and you not only have sexual health, but the way that sex is discussed becomes increasingly the very opposite to what it was beforehand. It's so disenchanted that when you talk about sex today, particularly when you use the language of sex education, you almost turn sex into something that you'd rather not do, right? So, for example, we have expressions that we teach children in sexual education, which I struggle with, like sort of negotiated sex. That sex has got to be negotiated. Now, again, I don't understand that. What does that mean? What do you negotiate before you have sex? So do you sit down and you have two contracts and you have a debate about what is really kind of possible, and then you have responsible sex? Again, I don't understand that, because in normal human life, when you have sexual relationships, you don't see it as an act of responsibility. The reason why you have it is not because you want to be responsible. The reason why you do it is because there's an element of spontaneity there. There's a force there that's kind of driving you to interact with kind of somebody. And of course, what happens that when sex becomes subjected to this calculation, this rationalization, it becomes increasingly a formal sort of accomplishment. The informal, spontaneous dimensions of sex, which the 60s was talking about, is gone. And instead of the informal, spontaneous dynamic of sex, what you end up is its formalization. And basically what you end up with in the end is a situation where, as you know today, instead of allowing people to get on with it, when you go to university, you have consent workshops where you got to sit down and learn for yourself what it means to give sexual consent. And where increasingly sex then becomes micromanaged and regulated. And that's the irony in the 1960s. It begins as this big liberation, but by the end of it, you get to the point at which it becomes detached from intimacy, and the intimate act of a sexual encounter becomes rule-bound, becomes legalistic. So instead of an informal, dynamic relationship, you have a formal, rule-based way of regulating it. And I think that actually shows us that the positive potential of the 1960s was very quickly lost, and instead, the very narrowing of the way that sex is seen as a subject in its own right first begins to lead to its medicalization, and eventually, as it becomes medicalized, it becomes routinized, and it turns into a routine rather than to a spontaneous interaction that historically human beings actually enjoy doing. And they did it not because they wanted to be responsible, not because they wanted to negotiate, but because there was something that was drawing them towards one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I think there's a lot to interrogate here, and I'm going to come straight out to anybody who'd like to start the ball rolling.
I have a question. Just when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about like previous, the Freudian, the obvious kind of Freudian basis. You could have, you know, was there any sort of basis to that earlier? Was the way Freud dealt with sex with his particular writings? Did it actually create this Krafft-Ebing? There's a discussion of sex at that time. Did it have any movement that way, or is this a very special aspect, as I suspect, of the 1950s and 60s?
Hi. I just wanted to question when you mentioned about the emergency pill, the morning after pill, with the specific focus you put on the word emergency. I think when it was introduced, it was help to combat this fear that was in amongst circles of rape culture, and women were able to be gifted power from having this morning after pill, going in and speaking to women in cubicles, in pharmacies. And this brought about so much more change and discussion from that. And specifically emergency, I just wanted to pick up on your focus on that word, because the female body is flooded with progesterone when you take this pill, and you have an emergency period, and you're not warned of these side effects at all. And I think the word emergency is actually really, really important. As a part of what this pill is. And also your mention of how bringing about medicalization in sexual health is very routinized. But I think that routinization gives access to freedom and to further exploration of oneself, rather than pushing down on too many boundaries of, we have quite a few of them already that exist, you don't need any more, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what you make of the kind of contradiction that there seems to be playing out in the way we talk about sex today. Because on the one hand, you're absolutely right. We have this, discussion of consent workshops. Almost, sex education sometimes would more accurately be described as anti-sex education. But then on the other hand, we do also have a pornified society. One of the most fascinating kind of cultural phenomenons of the last few years, which I'm sure lots of aliens will be interested in studying at some point when they arrive here, is Channel 4's Naked Attraction, which is just letting it all hang out, but also in a very strangely desexualized way. There's something very odd about that program worth looking into. So yeah, what do you make of that contradiction where sex is seemingly everywhere, but at the same time it feels sometimes more forbidden than ever? And if you look at the kind of surveys of younger people, you can see that they're having less and less sex than older generations, and the younger people are virgins till much higher ages and things like that. So there's a kind of Yeah,
I was wondering, Frank, what you see emerging from the developing sphere of anthropology in that period, and whether you think there was a lot of projection of what tribal or more primitive societies were like in relation to their sexual behaviors, whether that was accurate or projections. Obviously, we know that Victorians used to project the Middle East in particularly as sexually licentious. Now, the very opposite is true on the whole in terms of our beliefs about what goes on in those societies. So in many instances, how we view other people's sexual behaviors have more to do with ourselves than the others. And I was wondering to what extent anthropology may have contributed to all of that.
I think that a lot of the things that people are asking questions about relate to the scientism that surrounds sex, which is the way in which science is used inappropriately in order to make statements about how we should have what our sex life should be, what's good sex and bad sex. Because the thing about science is that science tells us quite a lot, But given the fact that sex is never a million miles away from a particular context involving human beings, and given the fact that the context within which sex occurs is a very fluid one and very changeable one, I think that the attempt for expertise to make these big statements is rather misguided. And very often you'll find that when you examine the message of sex educators and sex experts, they are using sex as a medium through which to introduce certain moral values. And is there moralizing? I think the emergency contraception is a very good example. I've got a PhD student who's been looking at the evolution of the discussion around emergency contraception, because initially it wasn't called an emergency contraception. It began to be called emergency contraception by health professionals who told women that you can't have this unless there's an emergency. That was the argument. Whereas in fact, if you look at it from a purely sort of practical point of view, using those pills on a more regular basis is no better or no worse than taking contraceptive pills. And in a sense, there's a very strong moralizing element in there, so that a lot of women, when they go to Boots or they go to a health professional to get an emergency contraception, are very often given a little lecture about, is this the first time? If it's not the first time, don't you think you should think a bit more about the way you're regulating your contraception? Shouldn't you be doing this and shouldn't be doing that? So I think that there is a very interesting kind of moral impulse, which has a desire to kind of create a sense of what is responsible sex and what is irresponsible sex as being very important to that. So I do think the language we use around reproduction is never neutral. It's always conveys certain values, certain kind of moral kind of values. And I think that comes from the scientism, which is the ideology of science used inappropriately in human relations. It also leads to the fetishization of sex. I mean, what is pornography? I think what pornography is when sex becomes fetishized to the point that it becomes detached from real human emotional interactions. It desexualizes sex. That's the irony about pornography. It desexualizes sex and recasts it in this kind of purely narrow physical form. And I think what I find very fascinating, and it took me a long time to pick up on this, is that we had this dramatic shift from a moment when pornography was associated with these dirty old men in their raincoats carrying around these brown envelopes secretly because they were so humiliated and embarrassed by what they were doing. You get to the point where some of my students, when they're 19 or 20, come to the university and say, oh, this is my porn, in the way that they would talk about, well, this is the novel I'm reading, right? Or this is, and it becomes, for them, a constituent element in the way that they regard sex. And I'm not puritanical. If you want to watch pornographic films, you can do that as much as you want, as long as you understand that in the very act of doing it, you are not only sort of watching a fetishized fantasy representation of what sex is about, you're also becoming part and parcel of that fetishized reaction, that you yourself are detaching yourself from what real sex is really all about. Because I think most people would agree in this room that there's like a qualitative difference between real sex, done between human beings who sweat, who got pimples on their faces, who may be a little bit overweight, who might be balding a little bit, who might have bad teeth, those kinds of people, which is almost all of us in this room. Or maybe I'm just projecting myself into that kind of domain. There's a difference between that and with what you see kind of projected on the screen. But that kind of fetishization or sort of dynamic comes out of the medicalization of sex. I think the anthropologists that you're talking about are interesting because like Europeans today, they always seem to discover their sexual self in an exotic, safe environment. So basically, European peoples in modern times have tended to project their sexual imagination onto other people and to rediscover it and kind of bring it back. And that, I think that still goes on today, you know, sort of, and isn't all that different, but I think that's really what the anthropologists were doing, where through the behavior of other people, they could rediscover themselves in the way that they saw that. And the question about Freud, I don't want to go into because that's a complicated story, but I think that, yeah, it was the beginning of some of this discussion, but Freud at least had a scientific approach to the question, which meant that he was rather restrained. He was never a sex expert, and he never advised people on how to have a good time. I mean, he knew his limits.
Thank you. The thing that's popped up into my head is where are the discussions happening, and is there a class sort of element that's gone on during the years? I'm just thinking about during the 1980s when I was teaching in a pretty rough secondary school, comprehensive, but where quite a lot of teenage pregnancies and so on, and we ran family life and childcare education and that sort of thing, but that you wouldn't have got in the grammar school. And so it seems to me that there was some sort of different sort of attitudes to sex going on depending on who you were in education. But you know, that's just an observation. Who wants to come in now?
If you're easily offended, just leave now. Frank, how do we reconcile naked attraction, vajazzling, Brazilians, etc., with the kind of Me Too attitude to if you put your hand on my knee, I suspect you're trying to rape me culture?
I was interested in spreading the debate out a little bit, and I see the 20th century as being sort of very responsible for the introduction of the ideas of moral relativism and cultural relativism. And I wonder what your thoughts were about what came first.
I was giving a lecture to my students using your Culture of Fear book, and I was trying to explain that over the last 20 years you often get a freeing up of things, but at the same time a desire to regulate. So like drinking. So you can drink anytime you like, but you have to drink responsibly. Right? And you have to be lectured about that. You can't be trusted with that freedom. Or gambling. Right? So you can gamble, it's on your phone, everything. So you're free to gamble. So the moral dimension of it declines, but the kind of risk safety aspect develops. And then I was thinking about pornography. Thinking porn's everywhere, but there don't seem to be any warnings. So I was cracked a joke and said, well, what's the logic here? What should happen? Because what should happen is the porn screen should pop up and it should say, masturbate responsibly. But it doesn't. And the only logical thing I could work out was, is it because pornography and masturbation has been celebrated as a kind of safe form of sex?
I just wanted to add on to that. I have heard Peter Tatchell argue for the promotion of mutual masturbation in schools as an alternative to sex because it is safer and, you know, less risky, doesn't upset people as much, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that masturbation is very interesting in the sense that if you look at the 19th century, you had all these panics about masturbation. And the idea was in the 19th century that if you did it, you became blind or you got various kinds of skin diseases and it kind of deprived you of your vital spirits. And there's all these books that were published on the dangers of masturbation. That was a huge, you know, kind of moral panic about it. All the way through the early 20th century, it was seen as being a major threat to particularly to masculinity. But it also was a threat to womanhood, you know, because apparently it kind of deprived them of their vital energies. And I think what is very interesting is the speed with which masturbation mutates from something that makes you blind into something that is seen as being responsible, you know, sort of safe and liberating. And, you know, that happened in a very sort of speedy way. And it is interesting. I mean, as you know, sort of as somebody that's been around for a few years, I find it quite interesting that there are attempts now, for example, in Warwickshire, teach children as young as 5 or 6 about touching themselves. You know, how you go about touching yourself and feeling good. And the one thing I know is that no matter what kind of background you come from, historically, people have managed to learn how to touch themselves, you know, without there being a sort of significant intervention by experts and teachers who kind of pointed this out. I mean, it's hard to believe that that was the case, you know, sort of, but there wasn't a need for any of this. And the very fact that people now bring it upon themselves, that schools think that this is something that they ought to do, says a lot about the sexual mores and the sexual culture within which we are working. And I think the way to understand this is that every single culture attaches some kind of value to sex. And these values often have a very significant moral content to them. And, you know, for example, Christianity has got certain very clear moral assumptions, you know, that you're associated with sex. It's linked to natality, it's linked to bringing children into this world, it's linked to some kind of union that seems to have a kind of quasi-sacred kind of purpose to it. You then move on to a situation where you have romantic love, and sex and romance in its traditional form are seen as being totally inseparable one another. And you ask the question, well, what is the value that's attached to sex today? What is the cultural value that you attach to sex today? Well, it isn't the Christian sense of a union, of transcendence. It isn't what Shakespeare wrote about in his lovely sonnets, and John Donne, when he talks about two people coming together and becoming one, if you remember. Isn't any of that? Isn't the 19th century romance that's linked to sex? None of that is particularly, you know, people are too cynical about romanticism in the 21st century. The one word I hear coming up time and time and time again from sex educators, from sex experts, from sex therapists, the one word that repeats itself time and time again is it safe? So good sex is safe sex. And I think that's very, very interesting, because the attempt to transform safety into a value that gives meaning to sex has a very important implications in the way that sex then becomes experienced. Because it basically means that people, fortunately not everybody, because I think there are a lot of sensible people around, but a lot of people increasingly begin to experience sex and look upon sex through the prism of safety, through the prism of risk. And I think the minute you begin to do that, sex itself acquires a different quality. I don't agree with people. I don't think it's the case that people have less sex than ever before. I think that's unthinkable. I think as long as people are human beings, and as long as young people are young, you know, they're not just simply going to be satisfied with pornography. Although a lot of people actually describe pornography as the real sex, because that is the safest sex you can have, you know, completely. I think that people do, but they have it, and they can engage with it through the prism of safety, through the prism of being safe. I think that becomes increasingly important. And when that becomes something that lurks in the background, you know, then it has a slightly different consequence to the way that this is experienced, and maybe in different historical context and different cultural circumstances. So that's really what we should be looking at, and asking the questions, you know, whether we want our sex life to be dominated by the safety agenda, or is there more to life than safety?
Hi, I wanted to talk about the way in which sex has become an arena where it's very, very risky. I mean, when I was young, what we were warned about was you don't get into strangers' cars, you don't go into strangers' flats, you know. There was this whole concept of, you know, that there are bad men out there who will try it on and will attack you, and that was, you know, good advice, I think. But now it seems as though the categories of danger have expanded really exponentially, and I would be quite fearful if I had a daughter today, because it's not just, you know, the odd stranger who might be pouncing on you as you walk home from the tube late at night, but it's kind of this whole idea of organised gangs, of sexual exploitation, that, you know, young women on housing estates are being bullied into these drugs gangs and effectively used as, you know, unwilling participants in the criminal enterprise and essentially traded around amongst the gangsters. Now that's quite nasty. And I mean, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this idea that there is this huge culture of sexual exploitation of young people out there, which frankly, if I were a young person nowadays, I'd be hiding in my room and not daring to go out anywhere.
Okay, thank you. There is something I really don't agree with. To me, things seem a lot different. Sex is not something dangerous. Young people are not afraid and are looking for safe places. I don't feel like my whole youth I was educated about sex and expert want to talk. How you want to educate me? I rather feel like people are not talking about it. And I think that is the problem. Not that there are so many experts who are saying what's wrong, what's right. More like people and friends starting to talk about it very late. So many young people do not know how other people think and how things are and what they have to expect. I think that is a great bigger problem than people being too careful. I don't think they're too careful. I just think they don't know things and are maybe confused or ashamed.
I was just wondering how you saw the question of authority in relation to the sexual revolution, because I think over the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s, possibly into the 90s, the question of rebellion, anti-authority was implicit partly in sexual experimentation, that there was a physical act, if you like, which was the sort of anti-deferential way of young people acting out, you know, an element of sort of politics that was associated with a sort of breakdown of that sort of consensus that had existed up until that time. So in one sense, the sexual revolution itself seemed like an active act of rebellion. So I was just wondering in the discussions as they're happening today, given that there appears to be a policing through the sort of increased mediation of discussions about sex through universities, for example, how that appears to be playing out in terms of people's attitudes towards authority. And is there mass rebellion on campus where people are saying, I'm not going to go to that, consent class, because that's an imposition of authority against my ability to act freely. So it's about freedom, authority, and acts of rebellion. I think I'm interested.
Sorry, I need clarity on the amount of sex here. I thought reports out at the minute say that young people smoke less, drink less, take fewer drugs, and have less sex, which makes sense to me. And I wanted to ask you about this. There's a book called Unwanted Advances, and she looks at, particularly at university life, and she's kind of looking at how young women approach sex today in a kind of a way where it's as if it's something dangerous that's done to them, rather than she went to uni and she just wanted to have sex with everybody, kind of lecturers and blah, blah, right? And so she's just describing it's a kind of like a loss of subjectivity of women, this idea that if you think of yourself as a doer who's going out there taking risks and all the rest of it, you experience even very difficult things in a very different way to if you see yourself as vulnerable and being done to. And my concern, and I'm wondering what you think, because you often discuss the way lots of things are developing, where you've got experts and a kind of colonization of the family and so on. And I often see barriers to that. I often see that it's kind of a bit more difficult to get in. But on this issue, especially because so many young people go to university, I worry that the kind of hashtag mentality is the most dangerous new development in terms of the colonization of people's intimate life. And I wonder what you think about that.
I think that there are a lot of reports out. There's a very interesting book by Jean Twenge on the I generation, which basically shows that young people are having less sex than than ever before. They're not getting driving licenses as frequently. They're doing less things independently. I think that's, a lot of reports are like that, which basically captures the zeitgeist understanding of how human behavior is. I've come to the conclusion that just about every single report that I've seen on sexual behavior, every research that comes out, has got to be seen in a fairly questioning, skeptical kind of a way. For the very simple reason that, the research, when you ask questions, how much sexual experience that you've had and all the rest of that, I don't think actually captures the real situation. And I think that what those reports are really saying, where they are important, is they basically are expressing attitudes that exist within the world around us, right? So they're actually accurately capturing that. Now, the way to understand this, certainly from a sociological point of view, is this. Historically, for example, in Europe, sexuality was associated, and sexual behavior, with guilt. I mean, guilt and shame were used as a regulator of preventing particularly the public expression of certain forms of sexual behavior, but also certain sexual encounters. And that was very, very important because it influenced how people went about having sexual life. Basically, it had a very big impact. And it didn't mean that it stopped people from having sex, but it did mean that sometimes people felt guilty about it, right? I mean, it worked to the extent to which a significant section, not everybody, a lot of people just get on with it without feeling guilty, but a significant section of people did have a guilt feeling because that was something they've internalized in the process of socialization. Today, I think we have very similar, comparable development. A lot of people talk about responsible sex or negotiated sex or safe sex, but it doesn't mean to say that they keep their pants on all the time. And it doesn't mean to say that they kind of adopt the cultural script of safety 24 hours a day, because things are very dynamic. And what I actually think is going on is that people are having probably, not qualitatively different amount of sex than before. You can't really count. It's not something you can quantify. Obviously, there are particular moments, when people have far more sex than other times, like 1968, 69 would be 2 years, when people basically had sex with anything that moved, and that really wasn't something that continued into the 1970s, but there are certain years like that. But by and large, I think that that human beings, young people, are fairly active in this domain, and I think it's wrong. A lot of people think, oh yeah, things have changed fundamentally. What they are really saying is that the ethos around sex had changed, and I think that is absolutely right. The ethos around sex had changed, and I think that you talked about sexting, for example. Recently, I talked to a couple of young guys about sexting because it's not something I relate to either. I never sexted anybody, so I probably haven't got a life. That's what it means, But what they were actually saying and what they were expressing was that so what are you doing here? What's the point? Other than running up your phone bill, what is going on here? And they said, well, this is like a way of flirting, right? So as far as they're concerned, they try to put it into my language, So for me, this is a kind of way of flirting and whatever, and that's merely a different way of expressing an impulse, within the domain of safety, right? I think you're very lucky, the young lady from Germany, I imagine, because I think it may be the case in Germany that nobody talks about sex, and that's probably to do with German humorlessness and whatever. I'm not really serious, but I can tell you that in British society they never stop talking about sex. And I remember when my 14-year-old boy came home from school, he knew more about sex than I did. I have to ask him, can you tell me what this means? How does this work? Because he was continually exposed to sex education, and that was something that he picked up at a very, very early age. So I do think people talk about it, but it is interesting because periodically You get a sex expert do a TV program, and they say, the big problem in society is nobody's talking about sex, right? At a time when everybody's talking about sex. And I think the reason why sex experts say that nobody's talking about sex, what they really mean is they really want a bigger audience, for their own views. And it's their way of saying you should listen to me in terms of what I'm really saying. I don't agree with you that the world is so horrible in terms of young women. I think if you look back to the 19th century, you had a moral panic about slavery, where white girls are being enslaved and sent to North Africa. You had prostitution gangs there just as much as we have now. I think in many ways, the degradation which young women face today, and that is a very real problem, I don't think it's qualitatively different than in previous times. Arguably, the pressure upon young women, the wrong kind of destructive pressure on young women, was probably worse in the 1950s and in the interwar period than it is now, because that was normal. To treat women as objects of fetish was far more accepted in previous times than today. And I think the horrible things that you talk about are not the exception, but the norm in terms of human civilization. But fortunately, that is not something that most young women are confronted with. That is principally the problem that particularly young women from marginalized, poorer communities have got to deal with. And I think that, sort of to that extent, we should be wary of it and deal with it and make it public and contain it. But we should see it as a kind of, within the context within which it works.
I think we've got time for one round.
How do you see prostitution figuring into all of this? Because you've said that over the last few decades, sex has become more transactional and less romantic. Do you see prostitution has changed in the same way?
Frank, lots of discussion this evening has been about young people, but recently there were reports saying that older people are getting more STDs. There's all these dating sites for older people.
Have you got the website name?
I understand, my friends told me. So it's like you had sex in 1968, 1969, and you've continued to have it. So have you got any comment about this phenomenon? How?
Just going back to the 60s, Frank, where does Eric Fromm and The Art of Loving fit in, which I think was written in the very early 60s or late 50s, and how important was that as a factor in what you've been talking about?
I think just on the thing about the old people and STDs and all of that, I honestly think quite a lot of it's got to do with sexual health organisations trying to create a new role for themselves and looking for new audiences to address, and new contracts and new sources of money. And this is seen as being a way of doing it. I wanted to make the point that I think this discussion about whether people are having more sex now or less sex now is a kind of difficult one, because there's always a kind of implicit sense in it that there's the right amount of sex for people to be having at any particular period of time, which I don't think is the case. And I think that one of the problems that we've got is that we tend to look at our own experience of when we grew up and assume that that's like a kind of norm at which other things diverge from. And I think that it would not, you're very convinced, Frank, that young people today might talk about it differently and record it differently, but their behavior sexually is not very different from the way that it was in the past. I don't know why you would abstract sex from a whole load of other things that are going on with young people that would suggest that they probably are having less sex, say, than my generation did when it was growing up. And that's simply because, if you look at why, if you stop thinking about the sexuality, sexual impulse thing, and you think a little bit more about social contexts, what was very clear about growing up in, say, the 70s was there really was not a lot to do. There really wasn't a lot to do. And you combined the fact that you got tipped out of the pub at 10:30 on a Saturday night, on a weekday night, because that was closing. The TV, there was nothing on the TV, and because you'd only got 3 channels to watch, and so on, and your parents were at home. And combine that with an aspiration towards coupledom that people had. It was, you know, to be dating someone, the aspiration to be part of a relationship was very high. And I think that probably that did drive people for more sexual intercourse between couples to take place, which has got nothing to do with sexuality, passion, or urges. It's simply got to do with a way that life was lived by young people then. You then compare it to young people today who, when you're sexting, you're not in the same room as someone. You know, when you're worried about going out, you're not in the same room. There's a lot of other things that they can be doing to fill their time. So I'm not surprised if basically bonking on the back seat of somebody's car isn't a bit lower down the agenda than it was in our day.
I just wanted to ask actually whether you think there's a difference, about an age difference as well. I mean, what age have you been really aiming or at least talking about? Is it university age or younger? Because my sort of experience when I was, you know, a teenager was that there were most young girls were, and it was girls and girls I could talk to about it, but were having sex at age 15, 16, and I don't know if that's very much the case now or whether it's, say, whatever.
I mean, that is very much a class thing, as it is now, as you know, sort of in your days, because you'll find that you know, girls from working class, you know, sort of poorer backgrounds have their first sexual encounters at a much earlier age than girls from middle class backgrounds, you know, sort of. Well, that's what seems to be, unless you're that. Anyway, well, it's a free country, and you can disagree, but I mean, yeah. That seems to be the case, and you know, sort of historically. I mean, that's certainly in the literature, that's beyond debate that that's the way it is. But you know, maybe in your neck of the woods, you know, sort of this was a little bit different. But the point is that there is a class and a cultural thing. Certain groups, certain ethnic communities, for example, you know, where young women, for example, in a Muslim community are unlikely to have sex at the same age as white English women do or Afro-Caribbean girls do. So these are all culturally and class-based and quite specific, but it evens out overall in a kind of more generalized kind of a way. I think that what Anna was saying over there in the back, you know, it sounds plausible, and you may be right. The point I was making wasn't, you know, that one could, you know, that people are having sex in the same way as before. The point I was making is that the meaning of sex had changed. The values that are attached to it have altered quite fundamentally when you talk to people, but that doesn't necessarily influence the point at which people begin to have sex and how often they have it and under what kind of conditions. That's the point I was really trying to get at. And I was particularly saying that because there's a temptation, particularly about the older generation, to say, well, in my days we did this, but now people do that. And I know my parents did the same thing to me. In my days, you know, we did this, but you know, your generation is doing that. So I think we've got to be very, very careful and understand that sexual behavior, like any other behavior, is culturally specific, it's context specific, and it's sociologically quite specific to kind of key moments because of the way that it is done. I think what is important are the values that are attached to it. So somebody asked this question about prostitution. I think it's very, very interesting because the word prostitution historically carries a stigma. You know, like my mother didn't want me to marry a prostitute. You know, that wasn't, you know, like that wasn't her ideal of a kind of a potential wife in my family, because in her eyes, being a prostitute had negative connotations. It wasn't like being a school teacher or a nurse. And that had to do with the way in which sex and sexuality was perceived. Whereas today, in the 21st century, in the English language at any rate, but also a lot of languages, we have this concept of the sex worker, right? Now, the sex worker is different than a prostitute. I mean, they may do the same thing, which is to basically sell themselves for money, but the term sex worker removes the stigma that prostitution conveys. And very often, when you have discussions of this development on TV, people talk about being, I'm a sex worker, she's a sex worker, in a way that you would say I'm a secretary or sort of I'm a ballerina. That's the kind of way that it is used, and that indicates that the stigma that's associated with certain forms of sexual activities has been removed, and I think that's part and parcel of its fetishization, its autonomization, that it has that kind of an effect. It's not that I'm arguing for stigma, I'm not arguing for shaming people, but I do worry when the selling of sex is seen as being, that's cool, that's like working in a shop, because I do think that when sex becomes so commodified, in the way that pornography becomes commodified, when sex becomes almost an industry in and of itself, I think that the quality of human relationship itself begins to suffer. And I do blame people like Erich Fromm from that. There's a lot of these old German psychiatrists and psychologists that come to America, and they revisit their frustration on young people by advising them to lose their inhibitions, even though these guys themselves are probably more inhibited than anybody else is. And that's the irony about the sex experts, that when you talk to them, they're basically guys that are kind of paralyzed from the neck down, sort of. No, literally, they're not exactly players, not the kind of individuals, but yet, sort of, they got very, very strong opinions upon what you and I should be doing in our bedroom. Anyways, thank you for coming, and thank you for staying.